If you're going to treat me one way when the economy's good and another way when the economy's bad, guess what?
Yeah, it changes the game.
So the model works well for customers too.
Got
it's
it.
that give-gain proposition. And one way to understand that is to ask them, what would you expect to happen on your first day, in your first week?
How many people actually ask that question?
I don't know of too many that do.
So we've been in this series with Joan and I. Thank you, Joan, for joining again. This whole idea of HR is confusing, not confusing, where recruiting fits into HR, and all the dynamic of this. And Joan, the reason we're having this conversation again is you have this awesome kind of wheel, as I'm referring to it, on all of the pieces of HR and how they roll together. How did you come up with this in the first place? Because then I want you to explain it to me.
So that's a really good question, Steve. You say HR is confusing.
Yeah.
And you only say it because other people have.
Well, we talked about it in the first session. The first quick video we did, it was, why is HR so confusing?
Right. And even as an HR practitioner, it's confusing because there's so many parts and pieces.
True.
So for my own sanity, I put together this model that said, what are the key phases of HR? Starting with the
employee life cycle, so to speak?
From the employee, and I don't look at it as a life cycle, I look at it as a continuum, because to me, life cycle assumes death cycle.
Yeah, linear, it start, stop.
It does.
Yeah.
And so that continuum is really interesting because you do the attraction as the starting piece, right?
Okay.
And then I had to ask myself the question, what comes next? Well, then you recruit somebody, right? And if you do a good job with that, you're welcoming them into the organization.
So you're going to onboard them.
You're going to onboard them, right?
Yeah.
And then from there, they have to perform. That's why they're there, is to perform. Once they do, you're going to reward them.
Okay.
Right? And if you do a really good job, you'll retain them.
True.
Right?
That's right. Which is the goal.
Which is the goal.
To retain my performers.
Correct. To retain performers. That's a really good articulation. And then there's transition. And people always saw the transition as out of the organization, right? But it doesn't have to be. Transition can be into your next role inside the organization. And guess what happens then? You start the cycle all over. You're attracting them.
Into that new position, into that new responsibility, into that new role.
Right.
Because potentially if they're in a new division reporting to somebody new, it's almost like a new job all over again.
It is.
Okay.
And there's one transition that happens really hard, is that individual performer to leader. And we forget how to orient people into that new set of expectations. So that's why I like that continuum, is because you start over again at the very beginning and you leave nothing for chance.
So I get that continuum. I think that's a really great way to look at it. So, and you just mentioned each of the steps. Correct. Or each of the pieces in the continuum. Drill down in each one of those a little bit more to make sure that everybody understands it. Because you've explained this to me a couple of times, and now I get it. Because I've generally been, again, on the front end of this. A little bit of the attract piece, a lot of the recruit piece, sometimes a little bit on the onboarding, and a sliver in terms of performance if we do those pieces right.
Right.
But you've walked me through this a couple of times, so walk me through it again.
Well, and before I do that, there's a piece on the outside.
Yeah.
Is the focus on the customers, right?
What do you mean?
It all has to tie back to how do we support our customer expectations?
Okay. Okay.
So that we can do the same thing with customers. We can attract them. We can bring them in the organization.
Sure.
We can help them show how we're going to perform for them. So it's slightly different, but the phases really are applicable to customers as well.
So if I'm a CEO, it's kind of the same business process I'm following, which in turn I'm following now in HR. They're really similar if you think about it.
They're very similar. There's elements that overlap in both and translate really well. And then there's a core piece, and it's a give-gain proposition.
Say that again.
So it's a give-gain proposition that's at the core.
Okay.
So you're the employer, I'm the employee.
Right.
Right? As an employee, you're going to give something,
and
you're going to gain something.
So I'm going to give you a paycheck. I'm going to gain the work that you do for me.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And as the employee, I'm going to give my talents, my energy, my strengths to the organization, and in return, I will get rewards for that.
So it continues this give and take on both sides. It's not just a one-way street. Okay.
It's not a one-way street.
That's the core principle to what you're talking about.
It is the core principle, and it works really well when we have economic changes. Because if you're going to treat me one way when the economy's good and another way when the economy's bad, guess what?
Yeah, it changes the game.
Yeah, it changes the game, right? And it's the same thing for the customers. So the model works well for customers too. It's that give-gain proposition.
Okay, so with that at the core of it, again, we've got this continuum of things. And I think we understand the attraction. We've talked about the attraction. We did a previous video on kind of the employment branding, who the company is and so forth. So I think that one's probably pretty clear.
Okay.
So that's step one, right?
Magnetism that happens.
Yeah,
at the front end.
that was probably the best description. And I know when you talk about that piece, you actually have a little magnet as your icon.
Absolutely.
Which I think is cool. That's a really good way to explain it. So this is the magnetism to potentially attract a candidate. Some companies don't have the magnetism.
Some companies are just using the poles on the magnets wrong. So,
yeah, there you go.
Instead of attracting, they're retract.
They're pushing.
Yeah, they push people away,
Yeah.
right? So that's understandable.
Okay.
The recruitment piece, you can explain that
Yeah, I
better
got the
than
recruitment piece down, and we've talked about this too, and really understanding. I think the key to recruiting is never was skills. Resume. That was the only thing that so many people have looked at for so long.
Right.
It's really understanding. We follow a process called results-based interviewing, and it's really about what are the key things that they have to accomplish in that role. We'll kind of backtrack to what we think they need to have in order to accomplish that, right?
Okay.
And so we've got to find folks that have accomplished something similar in a perfect world, because if you did it once, you'll probably do it again.
Yep.
Behavioral-based interviewing says the same thing. And then we've got to make sure that the fit is good there as well, which is, we talked about this. We became a predictive index certified partner some time ago, so we can really focus on that fit even a little bit better and focus on the whole human being, not just knowledge, skills, and abilities, which we always go after,
right,
but what's in their head and ultimately what's in their heart.
Okay.
And if we can do all of that, tie it into you leverage your attraction piece, we've got the recruiting. But now I've got to do a handoff.
Right.
I've got to give the candidate back to HR.
Yeah.
So now what happens?
So in a perfect world, as you said earlier, right, HR and the hiring manager would be synced up with how to bring that person into the organization.
Okay.
Right. When they come in, they should have a place to park. Maybe not, a spot, but there should be a parking facility somewhere, or a lot, or understanding of where to go to get parked.
The onboarding experience is
that whole
is
onboarding
critical.
experience.
We did, just kind of off this, we interviewed one of our team members a couple of weeks. She just started, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
And I put her on camera, and we were talking about experience, and I said, "So was everything ready for you?" And she's like, "No." So we were an exact example of what not to do. Now, luckily, she's still here, but we just went through this ourselves. That's really important.
It is really important, and people know what the base is, but then you have to ask the question: somebody who's starting with this team in this role, what are they going to expect?
Yeah.
And one way to understand that is to ask them, what would you expect to happen on your first day, in your first week?
How many people actually ask that question?
I don't know of too many that do.
I think it's more,
right,
this is what we want you to expect, not what would you really
right,
want to
this
expect.
is what we're going to give you.
This is what we're going to
work
give
with
you.
it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that onboarding piece becomes really important. It's not just that first day or the first 2 days. It's using something that I call performance or visual mapping.
Okay.
And it takes you into certain checkpoints, maybe that first week,
Yep.
maybe the first 30 days, 60 days, 80 days.
Yeah, you say 80 days. Nobody
Right.
ever says 80 days. It's 30, 60, 90. And
Right.
you've said 80 a few times.
I have. So when do you make a decision about someone who's on probation?
90 days.
Right. So why would you evaluate them on the 90th day and put yourself behind the 8 ball to have to maybe make a decision in the morning to change your actions in the afternoon?
Hence why I do them 30, 60, and 80
30,
before you
60,
get to
80.
that 90 days
Right.
at the first place. Okay.
Yeah. And we'll talk about performance in a minute from the employee's perspective.
Okay.
That helps drive that timeline as well.
Okay.
So, and then, after that 80 days, then you have a 3-month check-in.
Yep.
Right. That's
Yep.
very natural. 6-month, 9-month, and a year.
Sure.
And if you put in a visual format what that looks like and some of the key touch points underneath each of those, then the candidate knows, or the employee now knows what to expect, and the leader knows what to expect, and HR knows what's going on too.
There's no questions at that point from anybody of what to expect.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that onboarding piece then ties into the performance management,
Yeah.
because the onboarding really, the first 30 days, somebody should be really well oriented in the organization. Now, I talked with someone I work with, one of my colleagues. She's been working with me for 7 months. We were having a conversation just this morning. She said, I feel like the last 4 weeks or so, we've just really been kind of hitting it on all cylinders.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, you know why that is? And she said, no. I said, because you're already past, you're just past your 6 months. First 6 months, an employee is really not very useful.
Yeah.
Right.
They're still learning at that point.
Still learning.
Sure. You're still learning about them as the
Right.
employer, right?
And it's balancing how you work together.
Yeah.
Right. So that performance management piece then is on that visual mapping for onboarding, because you're now setting expectations for the future.
Got it.
No surprises.
Yeah.
If you operate out of a framework of no surprises, then it opens the dialogue.
Sure.
There's better understanding.
It eliminates assumptions, because you know what they say about assuming, right? I'm not going to say exactly, but that's the case. We make assumptions when we don't have all the information in the first place.
Just like we talked earlier about the stoplight.
Yeah.
We assume everybody knows what yellow is. No, we don't.
Yeah. It leaves too much to interpretation, as you said.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Perfectly stated, actually.
So, and then once somebody performs, they need to be rewarded.
Compensation.
Or
other things related to
non-monetary, or there's upside and downside rewards, right?
Yeah.
Downside rewards are called consequences for not performing.
Sure.
That is still a reward.
Yeah.
You get what you've performed for.
But you know the rules.
That's
the important piece to this.
That's critical.
Yeah.
And so, again, no surprises.
We were actually talking about the whole reward thing, and I mentioned there's people that will sometimes say to us recruiters, right? They'll say, it's a compensation game. It's all about comp for me. But when you really start to dig in, they don't pay me enough for the crap I'm putting up with.
Right.
So they don't really understand the reward piece too well. The employer doesn't in those particular instances. So laying it out like you're laying it out, this makes a lot of sense. Understand the consequences, understand the real rewards based on the performance of the individual. So it's not solely about the money. It's about the work I'm doing, and I'm getting compensated appropriately for that work.
That's exactly right. And it drives back to culture too.
Yeah, no question.
So,
well, I think, to me, all this is kind of creating the culture that, to me, is a very ambiguous term sometimes.
It is, until you break it down into the components.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like any other process improvement. You break it down to the simplest pieces.
Yeah.
You ask what are the drivers in that area. So these are all drivers for retention, which is the next step
piece to this. We want to keep those that are performing.
You want to keep people who are performing.
Yeah.
And so if you have non-performers, then you're not doing anybody any favors by holding on to people that maybe are miserable in their job. Maybe they didn't know how to do it in the first place.
Sure.
We didn't bring them in, right? We didn't understand what their talents were.
Yeah.
And their strengths. And I think strength-based organizations, people who say, I know that everybody can't do everything.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
I've got a laundry list of 29 expectations for a current client on a job description. And I'm like, okay.
That person doesn't exist.
It's not out there. Yeah. And for what you want to pay, it's really not out there, right?
Yeah, but the reality of it is nobody has 29 really great things that they do. That doesn't exist.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Setting expectations again.
Yeah. So that retention piece is driven by everything you've done up to that point.
Yeah.
And then transition has always been looked at, in my view, and from the conversations I've had, as somebody leaving that organization.
But it doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be.
They're moving up. They're moving into another role. They're getting another experience.
That's right. They're moving across. Maybe they're going to a subsidiary company,
But as you said earlier, they're kind of starting into a new role all over again. So the whole process of attraction and recruiting and all that starts all over again.
Right. And you use the visual mapping. You use the systems that you have in place for that person as they evolve into different roles. And again, no surprises. The conversations are enlightened rather than top-down driven, right? Two-way conversation. And you're really doing something that I think a lot of organizations have a huge gap in, which is that succession planning piece.
The thing I love about this is that you've taken what too many people think HR, as our first video said, HR is confusing. I mean, you've basically taken it and you've made it into a very easy to understand format with specific steps that are all focused on the performance of the individual that helps the company perform in the first place. This is basically the work you're doing every day for clients.
It is.
So this is the key piece. So we've got to make sure that all of your contact information is below this video so people can reach out to you directly. The other great thing about this is I'm more on the recruiting side and the selection side. You're more on the HR side. And we're actually working together.
Imagine that.
I mean, come on. And look, in fairness, and you've seen it too, there's a lot of organizations where those two pieces are attached to the hip and the handoff is really, really easy.
Right.
But it just seems like in most organizations, start, stop, the next process, start, stop.
It's a little clunky.
It's not your continuum all the way, a little clunky.
Yeah.
I think you're being nice. Some are really, really bad. This is probably the best I've ever seen. All of the different, there's 100 things that are going on under this, but this is probably the best I've seen the role of HR and what it does for the business explained.
Thank you, Steve. And you know, when you held it up like you did, it kind of looks like a page out of a coloring book. And
I love the colors. They're primary colors almost, right?
And I've long said, if you can reduce something to a coloring book and crayon story, then it doesn't mean that you're trying to dumb it down for anybody. That's a huge misnomer. It means that you're trying to simplify it so that other people can understand it. We're just translators. That's all we are. And we take what we understand really, really well. And if we can translate it for other people who aren't experts and help it tie back to the business, the goals, the outcomes,
that's the key.
That's where the magic happens.
Simple, but not easy.
Right.
And definitely not as confusing as people make it up to be, whether it's recruiting or whether it's all of the HR pieces.
That's the goal.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. If you guys have any questions around this whole continuum of HR, make sure you reach out to Joan. She obviously knows her stuff because I now understand it, so it's got to be pretty easy. And of course, on the attraction and selection piece, that's something that Qualigence does as an organization. But again, thank you for your time and all this. This stuff is great. I think we got to continue doing this to keep educating. And you said this to me earlier today or the other day about, you know, part of our job as peers is to tell each other when we're doing things great. Very well done.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Joan.
Okay.